if I remember from the readings and I remember from Dugan and such, if you go along, and we're going to get into Heidegger's notions in a second, but if you go along with them and you believe in them, it does take a pretty deep cut at universal liberalism. Yeah. So like I can see how people would want to reject that, who take universal liberalism to be gospel. It's like it's settled. It's the end of philosophy, end of history, universal human rights, universal this, universality. He does take a pretty deep cut at that.
Yeah, but look, Leo Strauss, I don't think anybody who studies him well enough and long enough, or just takes my word for it, could ever accuse him of being immoderate. Okay, Leo Strauss was a reincarnation of the Socratic spirit of wisdom and moderation combined. So Strauss is very concerned with moderation, but Strauss himself also recognized, he said that rational liberalism, Heidegger has basically pulled the carpet out from rational liberalism. His exact quote, I wish I had it right at my fingertips. What he said is that we have to make a very great effort today to find a reasonable basis for liberalism. But here's the big problem. The greatest thinker today is Heidegger. So in other words, liberalism is facing its own crisis independently of Heidegger. It needs our help to remain afloat somehow, to have a basis that's not just arbitrary and distorted from its original rational basis. But there's no great thinker who can provide a rational basis for liberalism, because today's greatest thinker, he said, is, just as you indicated, absolutely tears liberalism down. So that puts us before a very important dilemma. Do we sacrifice what we regard as philosophical wisdom or the truth of things for the sake of a political order that is sound but not true? Or do we say we have to consider revising the political order to make it closer to the truth as we have discovered it through our reasoning and through our philosophizing? There's a fundamental tension, or there may be, between what philosophy requires and what politics requires, or to put it differently, between the truth and morality, or however you want to distinguish those two things. And it's a challenge for everybody who thinks about these kinds of issues, especially for the history of political philosophy. What is the best way, not necessarily of resolving that tension, although there have been attempts to resolve it by saying, let's do a popular enlightenment. If we have a popular enlightenment, if we strive towards universal education of the masses, then we can close the gap between what politics requires and what philosophy teaches. Okay, but as Strauss taught in some of his works, if you want to have a universal education, if you want to have universal enlightenment, among other things, you have to have the technological conquest of nature, because you can't have universal education if you have scarcity. Education requires leisure. If people have to work for their living, they don't have time to read beginning with Heidegger or Strauss or anything else like that. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of work, and education as a rule was the preserve of the few landowners or wealthy people who have leisure. Okay, so that's fine, not a problem. We'll overcome scarcity by liberating technology and conquering nature. And we'll make sure that our liberation of technology has no moral or political control. It's just it's for the sake of popular enlightenment, and we'll have it be in the service of man's ever increasing progressive satisfaction. Well, as it happens, some negative externalities arise when you liberate technology from moral and political control and aim at popular enlightenment. So this whole question of the gap between the philosophical and the political and how you would close it, it comes with all kinds of very serious problems if you begin to think them through, as Strauss did and other people did. So then you're left with this question. Does that mean you have to have, maybe you use religion as a tool of control of the masses? Well, there you have your own questions and problems that arise with that. So acknowledging that the political and the philosophical are not necessarily in harmony with one another. They don't necessarily map onto one another. They may or may not, but we begin with the assumption of a gap between the two, and that's where there's a lot of things to think through. Heidegger definitely drives home the gap between what we take for granted as liberal Democrats, or as people who have inherited a liberal world, and what he has shown is the real baselessness philosophically of the liberal axioms.
Maybe we should have backed up just a second and just sort of describe the difference between philosophy and political theory, or philosophy and politics, because I think a lot of us believe in America for sure that like our politics is a direct extension of philosophy. But are these the same thing? Are they different? How are they different? Help us have a frame for that. Just I don't want to go too deep into this particular subject, but I think it's useful for us moving forward in the conversation.
Okay, there are a few different models for thinking about it. One of the classic ones that you and your listeners may find helpful, I think everybody who encounters it can find it helpful. That's Plato's cave. If you know about Plato's cave allegory, he says, here's our nature with respect to its education. We're like prisoners shackled at the bottom of a cave. We can't move our heads to the left, to the right. We can't move our bodies. All that we see are shadows on the wall. Of course, we don't see them as shadows. We take them as real. But a little bit up behind us, there's a fire burning, and there are people walking with artifacts and other items casting these shadows on the wall. And behind that fire, there's the mouth of the cave that opens out into the sunlight. And it's in principle possible to turn your soul around from the shadows on the wall and to go up and out of the cave to see the natural beings, first as they're reflected in the water, for example, or as they appear in the night, and then finally to look at the sun itself. So here you have a whole process of education that begins from where we are initially, taking some shadows as realities, and then you have the turning around of the soul leaving the cave. How this relates to politics and philosophy in general, a lot of people that I think give valuable commentaries have seen it this way. The cave, among other things, represents our opinions about political life, our opinions about what's good and bad, our opinions about the nature of human life. And those opinions are decisive. They're of decisive importance for the political regime's self-understanding, not only the American one. Every country, every nation, every civilization, every people, in some sense, has its own cave, its own understanding of what the world is, of what things are, and of how to make sense of it. But it's in principle always possible to drive that inquiry a little bit further and to try to get out of the cave of a horizon of opinion out into the truth itself. Now, if you think that the American political regime is just an embodiment of the truth itself, the self-evident truths, well, that may or may not be the case. But at the very least, it forces us to say, well, what is the truth about human life? All men are created equal. Okay, are all men created? What does that imply? What does it mean to say that all men are created equal? What's the circumstances of that utterance? What is implied in a natural law about the eternity of the human soul? Suddenly you scratch beneath the surface and you get into some very big questions. And philosophy is raising and trying to answer those big questions. As my man Leo Strauss put it, okay, in other words, as you and your Strauss for me, as I said, is key here. Here's how he put it in an argument that I think is very good. All political action, whether it is preservation or change, we want to keep things the way that they are. We want to stop them from getting worse, or we want to change them for the better. Okay, overthrow the previous guys. They were schmucks. We want to make it better, right? Or no, leave these guys because the next guys are going to make it worse. So all political action concerns preservation or change. All preservation or change has reference toward better or worse. We want to keep things from getting worse. We want to make them get better. But all thought of better and worse has reference to the good, because you don't know whether something is better unless it's getting you more of the good or closer to the good. You don't know if it's worse unless it's taking you further away from the good. So, okay, all political action implies reference to the good, but as a rule, our attitude towards the good has the status of opinion. We think we know, we opine that it's good for men to be treated equal, or we think we know that ... whatever we think is good, right? More equality, more equity, more control, more authority, stricter laws, looser laws. Whatever we think constitutes progress, in other words, whatever we think is good, has the status of opinion. But we, in principle, could question that opinion. I mean, other people have held other opinions. There are philosophers who argue in a great, not superficially. We're not talking about, I want to convey this. When there's a disagreement among philosophers concerning the idea of the good, about justice, the political life, human life, we're not talking about first-year college students who are like, yo, bro, I think man is not equal. We're talking about some serious thinkers here who adduce incredible conceptual, highly focused and concentrated argumentation in support of their view. These are not trivial differences, flippant or lighthearted. And I'll give you an example. Leo Strauss had a debate with Alexander Koyev, who argued in favor of the end of history. He said, look, man is a progressive being, and we are a historical being. We move through a progressive history that takes us more and more into the light, more and more into the truth. At T1, we have more truth and more light than we had at T0. Okay? As time unfolds, truth unfolds. And at some point, this process ends. And when this process ends, you've reached the stage called the end of history. And it has all kinds of implications about politics, about human life, and all of this. Leo Strauss and Alexander Koyev had a debate about these things in a book published in English called On Tyranny. And you see that on one hand, Koyev, so the reason I'm telling you this is because I want to show you that serious people do these arguments and that they lead to very real political consequences. Koyev's position has him defending tyranny. He says tyranny is completely rational in a good way. Tyrants help us have more truth in history. Okay, what the philosopher should help the tyrant somehow to realize through his tyranny what he's trying to do, but only the philosopher can really help him do it. What the tyrant really wants is the same thing all human beings want: universal recognition of his personal honor and dignity, or something like that. So it's sort of like a defense of the tyrant, a justification of tyranny. And sometimes he even says things that are really scandalous in this view, but it's very much related to the philosophical view that truth progresses in time. Strauss, who says that no, being does not unfold in time. Being is eternally self-same. Being is eternally self-identical. He's taking issue here with Hegel and Koyev on the basis of a classical understanding. So on one hand, this thesis about being, and suddenly he's not defending tyranny. He's defending moderation, constitutional order, a mixed regime, the interpretation of the law by sort of a class of decent gentlemen. So you think like, wow, these are two intellectual giants. Jack, they're way above the level of me and you and anybody who's listening to us. These are not stupid people, okay? And they have a very close connection between philosophy and are we justifying tyranny or not? Do we want a universal globalist world state, a classless world state? Well, you know what that means. No national borders, no boundaries. In fact, no identities at all that could introduce any sense of non-equality. What Strauss wrote in the late 1940s about the implication of this view was that if we continue on a progressivist, globalist interpretation of truth and human history, we're going to reach a point where the tyrants, the ruling globalist tyrants, will, and I'm quoting almost verbatim, will command their biologists to deny that there are any natural differences that are not totally compatible with the ideological doctrine of equality. In other words, they will force their scientists to lie about natural differences. Now, when you read that in 2020, even if you don't get all the argumentation about truth, being, time, history, the end of history, you say, wait a minute, they're going to command their scientists to lie about natural differences. Well, that doesn't sound like 1948. That sounds like 2018, 2019, 2020, and things are getting worse. Then I think you stop and scratch your head and say, gosh, what were these guys onto that they could see this then? How are we seeing the living consequences of these abstract principles that they were discussing 60, 70 years ago? That's in some sense the challenge. But all of that implies some opinion about what's good. What is human nature? Is this something that we should try to get away from because it's a limitation of our free, rational, technological development? Therefore, human nature is something to be conquered. Just like, look, I wanted to block out the winds. I put up a wall, right? I want to block out the cold, put in a heater. Now I want to block out the constraints of human nature. Fine, I put in some artificial intelligence nanotechnologies, whatever the case is, right? But it's all for the sake of overcoming nature as a constraint or as a limitation. But Strauss says, hold on. If you're interpreting nature as something bad, as something evil, as a constraint that you need to overcome, including your own human nature, you may have taken a wrong turn somewhere in your intellectual history, because at least the classical teaching, and Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Cicero, and many others, is that the nature of a thing is its standard. Somehow the best human life is a life that is the perfection of our nature. Nature is not something evil or bad, something that limits our free rationality. Rather, it is in our nature to be rational, and the perfection of our rationality is the perfection of our nature. Those two things are not separate in the sense that one is seen as the enemy to the other. And yet, in the course of history, in the course of intellectual history, Our attitude towards nature has changed, therefore towards technology, history, and human life itself. And so we face, at the level of the development of these principles, some hugely significant alternatives. Either, for example, transhumanist, post-humanist, artificial intelligence, technological utopia that wants to put an end to space, time, reality, and human life itself, and who wants to celebrate all of that as a good thing. Or, a little bit more moderately, we slow down, pause, see what we lost, and maybe return to the good natural life. After all, I don't know exactly, I can't remember on the spot who said it, but if you chase nature out the door with a pitchfork, it'll just come right back in through the window. So what are we doing? Are we chasing nature out the door and inviting it back in with a pitchfork? Or can we actually think these things through for a moderate alternative?